I notice there's a quiet assumption woven into most conversations about success, one that surfaces whenever someone asks what we do for a living or how our career is progressing. The question underneath the question is always the same: what have you achieved that gives you worth? I think of Marcus whenever this comes up, a man I knew whose entire existence seemed to revolve around proving this very equation, though the variables in his formula kept shifting in ways he never anticipated. Marcus grew up in one of those neighborhoods where achievement wasn't just encouraged but demanded as the price of admission to a better life. His father worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant, came home with hands that looked like they'd been shaped from the same steel he bent all day, and the only words of affection Marcus ever remembered hearing were variations of, "Make something of yourself." Not, "I love you," not, "I'm proud of you," but this conditional promise that value would arrive once achievement did. So Marcus internalized a simple belief that would govern the next 30 years of his life: he was what he accomplished, nothing more, nothing less. The early years followed a predictable trajectory. Marcus excelled in school because failure wasn't discussed as an option in his household, earned a scholarship to a decent university, and studied business with the focused intensity of someone who understood that education was a transaction, not an experience. He dated occasionally but never seriously because relationships felt like inefficient allocations of time that could be spent building his resume. His classmates would later remember him as competent but somewhat hollow, like he was already performing a role he'd been assigned rather than discovering who he actually was. When he graduated summa cum laude, his father shook his hand with what might have been pride or might have been relief that the investment had paid returns. Corporate life suited Marcus because it provided clear metrics for measuring worth. He joined a consulting firm where achievement was quantified in billable hours, client acquisitions, and the annual ritual of performance reviews that sorted humans into categories like livestock at auction. He thrived initially, discovered he had a talent for identifying inefficiencies in other people's businesses, and climbed the hierarchy with methodical precision. His colleagues competed against each other with the barely disguised hostility of people who'd been told there were only so many seats at the table, and Marcus played this game better than most because he'd been training for it his entire life. He made senior associate by 28, which meant something to the people who cared about such distinctions. But here's where Marcus's story takes a turn that statistics about career trajectories never quite capture. Around his 32nd birthday, he secured the largest client his firm had seen in years, a multinational corporation that needed restructuring consultation. The victory should have felt triumphant, and initially it did. He called his father to share the news and heard something in the old man's voice that might have been approval, though it was hard to tell through the chronic disappointment that colored all their conversations. Marcus worked 100-hour weeks on that project, sacrificed a relationship that might have become meaningful if he'd noticed it was happening, and delivered results that exceeded every expectation. The client was delighted, the firm was delighted, and Marcus was promoted to principal with a compensation package that would have seemed fantastical to the boy who'd grown up watching his father count coins. He sat in his new office on the first day of this achievement, surrounded by the markers of success that were supposed to confirm his value, and felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not pride, not even relief. Just a peculiar emptiness that he couldn't name because his vocabulary had never included words for experiences that didn't serve achievement. He tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, told himself that meaning would arrive once he'd rested, but the feeling persisted through vacations he couldn't enjoy and promotions he couldn't celebrate. Marcus had spent 3 decades building toward this moment, and now that he'd arrived, he discovered that achievement had delivered everything except the sense of value it was supposed to provide. The crisis deepened slowly, the way structural damage accumulates in buildings before anyone notices. Marcus began questioning not just his career choices but the entire framework through which he'd understood his existence. If achievement determined value, and he'd achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish, why did he feel so fundamentally worthless? He started missing meetings, showing up to presentations unprepared, and making the kind of mistakes that suggested his attention had relocated to some internal landscape his colleagues couldn't see. His performance reviews, those annual pronouncements of human worth that had once validated his existence, started including words like unfocused and not meeting potential. The firm handles decline with the same efficiency it applies to everything else. Marcus was encouraged to take a leave of absence, which is corporate terminology for disappear until you either fix yourself or resign. He spent 3 months in an apartment that cost more than most people's annual salaries, surrounded by possessions that documented achievements that no longer meant anything, trying to understand what had gone wrong. His father died during this period, suffered a heart attack at the plant and was gone before the ambulance arrived, and Marcus felt a grief that was complicated by the recognition that he'd spent his entire life trying to earn approval from a man who'd never learned how to give it. What happened next defies the neat narrative arcs we prefer for stories about redemption. Marcus didn't have a sudden epiphany or discover some hidden passion that had been waiting all along. Instead, he started volunteering at a community center in a neighborhood similar to the one where he'd grown up, initially because his therapist suggested that purposeful activity might help with what the psychiatric establishment had labeled as depression. He tutored kids in mathematics, which he'd always been good at, and discovered that teaching someone to understand quadratic equations provided a satisfaction that acquiring clients never had. The teenagers he worked with were navigating the same pressures he'd experienced, caught between neighborhoods that offered limited opportunities and the constant message that achievement was their only path to value. Marcus recognized himself in their anxious competitiveness, their fear of failure, their tendency to measure worth through external validation. He started sharing his own story, not as inspiration but as warning, and found that vulnerability connected him to these young people in ways that his accumulated achievements never could. They didn't care that he'd made principal at a prestigious firm. They cared that he showed up consistently, that he listened without judgment, that he saw them as more than potential success statistics. Something shifted in Marcus during those tutoring sessions, though he couldn't identify the exact moment of transformation. He began understanding that value might not be something achieved but something inherent, that maybe people had worth simply because they existed and connected with other existing people. This sounds like the kind of platitude that gets printed on motivational posters, but for Marcus it represented a complete rewiring of his operating system. He'd spent 35 years believing that he needed to earn the right to matter, and now he was encountering evidence that the equation had always been backwards. He didn't quit his job immediately because dramatic gestures rarely solve the underlying problems they're meant to address. Instead, Marcus negotiated a reduced schedule that allowed him to continue consulting while spending significant time at the community center. His colleagues interpreted this as evidence of diminished ambition, which was accurate but missed the point entirely. Marcus had stopped competing in a game where the prizes were impressive but fundamentally hollow. He took projects that interested him and declined those that didn't, violated every principle of strategic career management, and discovered that his value to the firm actually increased once he stopped trying to prove it. The teenagers at the community center became a kind of alternative family, though Marcus never articulated it in those terms. There was Jamal, brilliant at calculus but convinced that one bad semester had disqualified him from college. There was Sophia, working 2 jobs to help her mother while maintaining a perfect GPA and slowly destroying herself in the process. There was DeMarco, who'd concluded that academic achievement was for other people and was headed toward dropping out until Marcus convinced him that being good at math didn't require becoming someone he wasn't. These kids taught Marcus more about value than any performance review ever had, mostly by allowing him to matter in their lives without requiring credentials. Marcus started recognizing patterns in his consulting work that he'd been too focused on achievement to notice before. The corporations he advised were filled with people running the same race he'd been running, competing against each other for positions that promised fulfillment but rarely delivered it. He saw middle managers destroying their health for promotions that would require them to destroy it further. He observed executives who'd achieved everything their industry defined as success yet lived lives of quiet desperation that no compensation package could remedy. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, converting human potential into shareholder value while pretending this transaction enriched everyone involved. His approach to consulting changed. Marcus began asking clients not just how to increase efficiency but whether efficiency was serving any purpose beyond itself. He questioned metrics that measured everything except the things that actually mattered, challenged assumptions about growth as an inherent good, and suggested that organizational health might include acknowledging that employees were humans with value beyond their productivity. This didn't make him popular with firms seeking validation for their existing practices, but it attracted a different kind of client, organizations genuinely interested in aligning achievement with meaning rather than just accumulation. The path out of darkness wasn't linear because healing rarely is. Marcus still had days when the old programming kicked in, when he measured his worth through achievements and found himself wanting. He still felt the pull of competition, that seductive promise that one more promotion or one more victory would finally deliver the validation he sought. The difference was that he developed awareness of these patterns and could choose differently, could redirect his attention toward the tutoring session scheduled that evening or the conversation with a colleague who needed someone to listen without judgment. His relationship with achievement transformed into something more nuanced. Marcus didn't abandon goals or stop valuing accomplishment, but he stopped outsourcing his sense of worth to external validation. He got satisfaction from helping Jamal get into college, not because it reflected well on his tutoring abilities but because he cared about this specific kid with his specific dreams. He felt proud when clients implemented his suggestions and their employees reported greater job satisfaction, not because it boosted his reputation but because it meant people were suffering less. Achievement became a byproduct of engagement rather than the purpose of existence. There's a conversation Marcus had with Sophia during her senior year that captures something essential about his transformation. She'd been accepted to several prestigious universities and was paralyzed by the decision, terrified that choosing wrong would somehow invalidate everything she'd worked for. Marcus asked her a question his younger self would never have considered: which school felt like it would let her be the most herself. Not which would look best on a resume, not which would maximize future earning potential, but which environment would allow her to exist as a complete human being rather than just an achievement engine. Sophia looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language because this framework contradicted everything school had taught her about making important decisions. They talked for hours about value and achievement and the difference between building a life and building a resume. Marcus shared his own story, the years spent chasing validation that was always one accomplishment away, the moment when he'd achieved everything and felt nothing, the slow discovery that his worth wasn't something he needed to earn. He didn't tell her what to choose because the point wasn't to replace one set of external expectations with another. He just wanted her to understand that she mattered regardless of which university's sweatshirt she wore. The community center eventually offered Marcus a position as program director, which meant less pay than consulting but more alignment between his daily activities and his sense of purpose. He accepted after thinking about it for approximately 30 seconds, then spent the next week helping them restructure their operations with the efficiency he'd developed in corporate settings. His father would have considered this a waste of his education, proof that all those years of sacrifice had led somewhere disappointingly ordinary. But Marcus had stopped living for his father's approval around the time he realized it was never going to arrive. His old colleagues at the consulting firm struggled to understand the transition. They interpreted it as failure or burnout or some kind of early midlife crisis that would eventually resolve itself once Marcus recognized the error of his ways. They weren't wrong about the crisis part, but they misunderstood its resolution. Marcus hadn't given up on achievement, he just redefined what counted as achieving something. Teaching DeMarco to love learning felt more valuable than optimizing a corporation's supply chain, not because one was objectively better than the other but because it connected to something genuine in Marcus's actual human experience. The story doesn't end with Marcus having figured everything out because people rarely do. He still wrestles with the conditioning that taught him worth is earned through achievement. He still feels occasional pangs of envy when former colleagues announce their latest promotions or acquisitions. He still has moments of doubt where he questions whether he's made the right choices or just rationalized his failure to keep competing at the highest levels. The difference is that these moments no longer define his entire sense of self, and he's developed the capacity to sit with uncertainty without needing achievement to resolve it. What Marcus discovered through all this isn't particularly revolutionary or even original. People have been writing about the emptiness of pure achievement for centuries, and entire philosophical traditions are built around the recognition that worth isn't earned through accomplishment. But knowing something intellectually and understanding it through lived experience are entirely different things. Marcus had to lose everything that was supposed to make him valuable before he could recognize that his value was never conditional on achievement in the first place. He had to fail at the game he'd been playing before he could understand that the game itself was the problem. I think about Marcus whenever someone asks what I do for a living, that reflexive question we use to categorize each other's worth. I understand now that the question is less important than what it reveals about our shared assumptions, this collective agreement that people are what they achieve rather than simply being people who sometimes achieve things. Marcus's journey suggests that maybe value flows in the opposite direction, that achievement only means something when it emerges from a life that already has worth, when it serves purposes beyond proving that we deserve to exist. His story is sad in the way that all stories about wasted years are sad, those decades spent chasing validation through achievements that could never provide it. But it's also happy in the specific way that transformation is happy, not through the erasure of suffering but through the discovery of meaning despite it. Marcus didn't escape the darkness by achieving his way out of it. He escaped by recognizing that the darkness was partially created by the belief that achievement could save him, and that his value had been there all along, waiting for him to notice it existed independent of his accomplishments. That realization didn't solve all his problems or eliminate his struggles, but it did give him a foundation that wasn't contingent on winning competitions or meeting other people's expectations. And maybe that's the only kind of achievement that actually matters, learning to value yourself not for what you've done but for what you are, a human being trying to live with some combination of honesty and connection and purpose that doesn't require external validation to confirm its worth.